Unfortunately, I think the answer is yes, that momentum in all senses is with the left, though I agree that it's not necessarily the most intellectual momentum. It's a momentum from principles. The great success of Jeremy Corbyn is that he has persuaded people that the policies he believes in come from the fact that he is a socialist, and that therefore you see in what he is advocating a golden thread of belief and principle, as Nicky was saying, authenticity, that underlines what the Labour Party is trying to do. So when you consider the conference that they've had at Brighton, you realise quite quickly that of course they want to renationalise the railways. They are socialists, that is what socialists do. Of course they want to have free tuition for everybody because they're socialists and they like spending other people's money. That is what socialists do. And it gives a background to their individual specific policy precepts that they have clear principles. And that's why I think they have so much appeal, because many people, not just the young, are idealistic. And they want to think that there are politicians who will follow their principles rather than their major concern being office. And that this has faced us with a real challenge, not because we don't have principles, but because they haven't been what we have been talking about in recent years. And this has quite a long history. And I'm not going to give you a long history lesson, particularly not, as Sir Roger knows much more about everything than I know about anything. So if we're going to have history lessons, we get it from Sir Roger. But if you go back to Tony Blair's election victory, he wins on the basis that he has given up socialism, but that he will manage things a bit better than a worn-out Conservative government will do. And we then carry on in 1997, 01 and 05, we are still fighting as clearly identifiably Conservatives. But by 05, we lose very heavily again, and we think that the answer is to be a bit more Blairite or else we'll never win. We think that Conservative ideas are intrinsically unpopular, so we come up with all sorts of nonsense. We want to share the proceeds of growth. We want to have 0.7% given in overseas aid. We want to do things that match Labour because we have given up in confidence of our principles. And unfortunately, we do it at just the wrong time, because the financial crisis comes, and as we were sharing the proceeds of growth, we don't have a principled narrative explaining why it wouldn't have happened if we'd been in charge. So we have to carry on with this idea that what we're good at is being competent managers who will run things well, but not that our policies flow one from another because of our underlying understanding of what it is to be a Conservative. And this doesn't mean we don't do great things. We do really important and serious things, and I particularly highlight Ian Duncan Smith's welfare reforms and Michael Gove and, of course, Nicky's education reforms. These were very much important, successful policies, and they had underlying principles of themselves, but there was no overarching Conservative basic principle that made you know what the policy would be. You just argued for it because it was a good idea. And this, I'm afraid, reached its apogee in the election manifesto. That as you read the election manifesto, which no doubt all of you did assiduously, page after page, I did, and it won me one specific vote, because somebody came up to me and said, is it Conservative policy to get rid of the tolls on the Severn Bridge? And because I'd read the manifesto, I knew the answer was yes, and that was one vote in bag in North East Somerset. So it's a useful thing to do. But its flaw as a document was that as you turned the page, you couldn't guess what the policy was going to be, because there wasn't that underpinning that made one policy flow from another. So there were some good ideas, there were some bad ideas, but they didn't have an underpinning. And what I think is so disappointing about this is that Conservative values are enormously exciting for all generations. I loathe this idea that we've got to give baubles to young people. I think it is so desperately condescending. Young people are not some alien species who we have to treat differently from other voters. I'm sorry to say that I was young once. I wasn't. I wasn't very good at it, but I was at least technically a youth at one point in my life. But that actually young people, old and middle-aged people, want to understand what our principles are, and our principles are really attractive. What do we believe? Fundamentally, we believe that individuals making choices for themselves build up society, and that making decisions for themselves is better decision-making than can be made for them by the state. And when you say to anybody that they can decide their own life, that's an attractive thing, isn't it? Particularly, you say to people who have just left school and the authority of their schoolmasters, and indeed schoolmistresses, you say to them as they're leaving the authority of their parents, or you say to elderly people who don't necessarily want to have exactly the same nursing care as the next person, but they will have choices. That's really attractive. And the other thing we always believe in as conservatives is that we want to help people lead the lives they choose for themselves, not tell them how they ought to lead their life. So we're enabling people to buy their own home. We want people to keep their own money because we think they will spend it better than the government will spend it for them. We have enormous confidence in democracy, even when it doesn't vote in a way we like, because we think the mass random decisions of individuals are collectively better than the wise old birds in Whitehall, or for that matter, in Brussels. So yes, I agree with the question that the momentum, let's say intellectual for the purposes of this debate, but in truth, the view of principles. And what we need to do as conservatives is recognise that being enormously competent is not enough. We need that golden thread running through that means that the voters can understand what the policy will be before we have enunciated it, because it comes from first principles, and that this is actually more electorally successful in the end than being purely managerial. Because ultimately, given the choice...
We all now know to be very careful where we blow our nose in his constituency. It's a great honour to be elected for North East Somerset. From my family, it's a great honour. My father, or my noble kinsman, Lord Rees Mogg, as I'm now meant to call him, told me that between him, myself and my sister, we had tried 7 times with 1 victory. I fear if we were a football team, people would be calling for the manager to be removed. But it is also an enormous honour to be elected for North East Somerset, which is where I was brought up and where my family have lived for generations. And as everybody knows, Somerset is God's own county, and North East Somerset is God's own part of God's own county. I inherit the seat from 2 very distinguished gentlemen, from the honourable member, my honourable friend from Bath, who I'm very glad is now my honourable friend, because I discovered when canvassing that a lot of people unaware of boundary changes were still intending to vote for him. When they discovered they could no longer do so, they turned out to be lifelong Conservatives. So I welcome him to the peer-like coalition that we now have. The main part of the constituency was the old Wansdyke seat, inherited from Mr Dan Norris, a most distinguished member of the Labour benches and a parliamentary private secretary to the Right Honourable Member for South Shields, and he's probably sorely missed at the moment during a leadership election. He was the model of an assiduous constituency MP, worked tirelessly both as an Avon County Councillor and as a Member of Parliament, and I indeed have large shoes to fill. But turning to North East Somerset, as I said, God's own part of God's own county, it is a great place in British history. I'm not going to go back at any great length to Bladad, who in 683 BC founded Bath, having gone from North East Somerset and found some pigs who had a skin disease, and they washed in the waters of Bath, and Bladad, father of King Lear, founded Bath from North East Somerset. He's a rather peripheral figure, but Alfred the Great is more substantial. Alfred the Great, you must remember, in 678 AD, was just really having Somerset left. The Danes were all around. They had begun to take over all of Wessex, and they had much of the rest of England. But Alfred brought together the people of Somerset, of Wiltshire, and of parts of Hampshire, and they crossed over from the Somerset levels through north-east Somerset to near Chippenham, to Eddington, and there they fought the great battle on which our freedoms depend. They put paid to Danish occupation, and Alfred, a great lawgiver, a man we should think about in this debate particularly because he didn't want to innovate laws, he wanted to codify laws, he wanted to tell people what ancient rights they had and how they ought to have their liberties. So he was able to expel the Danes, and his grandson became the first king of England on borders we would recognise to this day. Moving a little bit later, the next great figure from north-east Somerset is Alfage, Archbishop of Canterbury, born in Weston, a village bordering north-east Somerset and Bath. He is really the first tax martyr. He was called upon to pay the Danegeld, and he took £48,000 to the Danes then at Greenwich and handed it over, and they said, "Mr. Alfage, we would like some more, and if you don't give us more, we're going to hold on to you as a hostage." And Alfage replied that I won't give you more, I will not put higher taxes on my people. I will not have them suffer this imposition. And so they threw ox bones at Alfage until he died. Now I hope that people won't find it necessary to throw ox bones at me, but I think as another representative from north-east Somerset, I will stand constantly for low taxation. And the final figure I'm going to mention in this great pantheon of wonderful figures from God's own part of God's own county is John Locke, brought up in Boluton, and this really is a sop to the Whig coalition that we now have, the philosopher of the Whigs, and in many ways the founder of the constitution that we now have, and a constitution that has as its essence that power comes from the people up to the legislature, which is there to supervise the executive. You will all know that the argument at the time was about the divine right of kings, and some may now think we have another form of divine right of the executive. Locke made it clear that the duty of the legislature was to check and to stop the executive exceeding the powers, the rights and the authority that it had from time immemorial. We take these three great Somerset men. Alfred the Great, the first Eurosceptic. He got rid of the Danes and made